So what I wanted to do now is just, I mean, I don't think I can, it's not going to be disappointing here. I'm not going to provide you with a fully, kind of satisfying, embodied, fully embodied, thoroughly embodied approach to emotion. But I want to actually at least kind of give you a sense of what could be an embodied critique to this traditional view of head-heart, which is then reflected in the componential view. So, this splitting emotions into the cognitive and the bodily part. So I would say, from an embodied perspective, the position to try to defend is the one in which emotions are not split into parts, but rather brain and body are deeply integrated, and then emotions are best understood as patterns of activity of this integrated system. So that's just a kind of wish. That's what one should aim for. I'm not giving you any argument now. I'm going to, however, try to raise a variety of considerations that might convince you that an integrative approach that doesn't neatly split between cognition and emotion is perhaps desirable. So I'm going to start with phenomenology and just point out that this is just the outline, but so we're going to do it together. I'm going to suggest that there is no clear distinction between appraisal and bodily feelings when we experience emotions. And then I'm going to review briefly some recent proposals made by neuroscientists where they say that, well, there is no clear distinction between cognition and emotion at the brain level. And then also point out that the brain itself is complexly interrelated with the rest of the organism, with the body. So let's begin with phenomenological considerations. And so we can do it together without, we don't need to talk about it. We can just imagine this. So let's just think about an experience, the experience of undergoing an emotion. So I'm going to ask you if you can just by yourself, silently, you don't need to talk about this with anyone, but just remember undergoing an emotion, or maybe you can imagine an emotion if that's easier. Choose whatever episode you prefer. So I give you 1 minute to try to remember what that's like. Don't choose something too upsetting. Just try to put yourself in that situation. Imagine what is it like when I'm having an emotion, and just choose one. Don't keep jumping from one to the other. Choose one episode. Okay, so then I'm going to ask you, well, can you just think about this episode and keep that in mind, and just think whether at all or how evaluation, appraisal is part of this experience. Were you doing any evaluation? Was it part of your experience? How was it part of your experience? I'll give you some seconds again to just ponder this.
Sorry, what does it mean? I don't understand how to tell whether I'm experiencing evaluation as part of my experience.
So, I'm asking just to imagine an episode or remember. And then in that episode, during that experience, were you doing any evaluation of, say, the person or the situation being dangerous or offensive or upsetting? Or was that part of the experience, or were you maybe just responding in a non-evaluative way, or were you actually making an evaluation? And if so, what is the relation to the overall experience you were having? So I'm curious, maybe you can leave this for your discussion time, but I'd be curious to say, well, did you think, if you did find that there was an experience of evaluating, was this experience separate from the emotion, or could you say there was an evaluation and then there was a bodily response or an action tendency? So Does it make sense to think of emotion experience in these componential, discrete parts? Okay, so I'm going to give you my own take on this. So just take an example of being afraid of meeting a bear in the forest, which is William James' famous example. William James has wrote this chapter in 1884, which is also reproduced in his book, Principles of Psychology, and is possibly the most famous chapter in Philosophy and Psychology of Emotion, in which he just imagined, encountering a bear in the woods, and he had his own account of this. But we're not going to talk about that. So now, it seems to me that it's not like this. It's not that I first cognitively evaluate experientially the bear as dangerous, and then I fear and run away. And I think, by the way, this happens also with higher cognitive states, or say being afraid of tomorrow's examination. It's not. So I don't think I'm trying to cheat by taking this example, but again, we can discuss that. And rather, it seems to me that it just, the bear looks scary to me from the start of the emotion. As I'm afraid of that bear, the bear is looking scary to me. And there is no separate moment, it seems to me, in experience of a cognitive evaluation that then initiates a sequence of other events. And I don't know if that's just, kind of trying to refer to authority to reinforce my point, but actually John Dewey made exactly this point. I was very excited when I saw it, because he said, we distinguish between evaluation or perception evaluation and emotional response in analysis, post-hoc, when we are trying to maybe give a kind of account that might fit with a certain scientific view. But as it happens, there doesn't seem to be any differentiation between seeing the bear as dangerous, evaluating it as dangerous, and being afraid of the bear.
I think it depends on the experience.
Yes.
In some cases, for example, if I find that somebody was lying, so because of logical reasoning, I found somebody was lying, then I become very angry.
Yeah.
So then the cognitive process, then the affective response.
Yeah, no, that's good, and that's why also I asked to think of your own experience. But I think, so in that case, I would say the following. It seems to me that, okay, you're realizing that someone is lying. And as you're realizing that, then you're also becoming angry. So it's not like, okay, you have like a dispassionate moment, or, oh, that person was lying. It's more like, as you're realizing that he's lying, that realization is already having an affective pull, right? It's like, oh, he's lying. So I just don't find any, well, actually that's even stronger claim, but is there a cognitive state which is just not, already, drawing upon our motivation, values?
I think maybe part of the difficulty is the use of the word cognition here, because there is a difference between something like I decide to be angry. I'm going to be angry now. I'd like to be angry, please. And actually processing information. You can take something which you would need to do some fairly sophisticated processing to understand that you should become angry. Like you watch something on TV and someone says something very abstract about budgeting, and then you realize, now like 1 million people are going to go without health care. That's not like the bear in the sense that it's not something where there's a smell or something.
Yeah, but if as you're thinking, now those people, if you're getting angry in that moment, my claim would be that those thoughts are presenting themselves already as emotional.
I guess what I'm saying is that I'm doing cognition even if I don't consciously work out each step of the chain of logic.
Yes,
it's just
yes.
a different level of cognition.
Right.
And actually a lot of what we think is this conscious, rational thought is probably being taken care of by that, not directly accessible, intuition and things like that.
Yeah, so that's, I suppose that's a question about, what, do we care about phenomenology here? Maybe you want to posit some cognitive mechanisms that are, automatic and unconscious that will trigger a variety of emotional responses. And phenomenology is not talking about that level. So I'm just telling you, well, what about experience? So if we think that we should start from experience, then, and I'm not saying that conceptually it doesn't make sense to say that there are cognitive appraisals. I think that's very important. It's not that I see the bear, I run away and there is no, of course there is an evaluation going on. But the point is it really distinct from the rest? And so I wanted to just conclude this little phenomenological point. But so even if, what about the body in these emotional episodes? I might well feel my body when I'm scared of the bear. I might feel the legs shaking, my hands trembling, the heart beating very fast. I'm not saying that's necessary. William James thought you had to feel these things to have an emotion at all. Maybe you're too, like, oh my gosh, that's the bear. You're not in any way noticing your autonomic responses. But I suppose I want to say even here, it doesn't seem to me that you can talk about these bodily feelings as just coming after an evaluation that the bear is dangerous, and not even themselves entirely non-evaluative. And that's something that, in analytic philosophy of mind in particular, often philosophers are extremely reluctant to talk about the body as being necessary for emotion because they think emotions can be reduced to thoughts. But because they think of the body as being something that is just responding and it doesn't itself, the bodily experience is just, I'm experiencing my legs shaking, and that's not in any way evaluative. And I think I'm not convinced by that. It seems to me that in the context of the whole emotion experience, the way I feel my body is laden with some sort of evaluation. And maybe that's related to the affordance view, actually. That's something I need to work on more. But Sean was talking about it. I experience this bear as something that I want to run away from. And the way I experience my body in the context of an experience is related very much from this. I need to get away. I mean, I'm sure you're not all agreeing with this. So let me then go on. I really would like maybe in the discussion period to talk more about what you think about this. I think, to go on. So now I'm going to move on and remember, so the idea, what I'm trying to do now here is just question this value of separating neatly between cognition and emotion. So I first made the point that experientially it's not clear that we can draw that distinction. I would rather argue that the two things come together. And now then let's move on to some neuroscientific accounts. So there is a traditional picture in neuroscience which is being very much criticized now, but I think it's still quite influential. And that's the idea that the brain can be divided into three parts. It's the triune brain idea that can be traced back to MacLean and the 50s. The idea that the brain can be divided into this new mammalian complex, mainly the cortex, paleomammalian complex, also known as the limbic system. By some people like to call it that way. Some people think neuroscientists here, they think it doesn't work, but and then the reptilian complex. And MacLean and others, they think, we can more or less talk about what this is cognition, and this is emotion, and this is more like instincts. And this is the view, they say reptilian brain instinct. I think it's survival, limbic system, emotions, and then what's that? Neocortex, logic, speech, high cognitive activity. And the emotional brain is often mentioned in terms of the limbic system. Now, as I mentioned, this view is being very much criticized now. But sometimes I do find it's interesting how these things happen, how some areas of neuroscience who are maybe particularly interested in this issue, they say no, 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 but then it pops out in other domains. So, for example, this is already 10 years old, but Mark Lewis, who is a developmental neuropsychologist, published a paper in Behavioral Brain Sciences, which I think maybe you all know is this famous paper in which someone publishes a very long paper, and then there are lots of comments and response to comments as very kind of prestigious. So Mark Lewis argued that appraisal and emotion overlap largely at the brain level. And what he did is, first analyzing appraisal into different components, evaluation, perception, attention, and others as well. And emotion, he said, well, we can talk about the components of emotion as being maybe arousal, action tendencies, feelings, and then looking at the brain and saying, well, it seems that there are lots of brain areas that are involved in both of these. So amygdala, for example, which has been still in some areas very much seen as, well, some people talk about the fear module. Some people say, well, it's certainly crucial component of the limbic or emotional brain. So amygdala turns out to be involved in evaluation as well as memory, action tendencies, arousal, and attentional orientation. The anterior cingulate cortex as well is involved in planning, attention orientation, as well as emotional feelings. Neural systems in the brainstem and hypothalamus, Mark Lewis says, they turn out to be mediating autonomic and endocrine activity to maintain the organism's internal equilibrium or homeostasis, contribute to emotional feelings, enhance attention, and prepare for action. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm just, I'm taking his word for it. And what he does is just reviewing lots and lots and lots of papers and concluding that, well, they all do their own thing. But then when you start to compare them, it turns out that when you look at separate brain areas, they turn out to do all these different things. So his suggestion is that really both cognition and emotion, or appraisal and emotion, are distributed over the whole neuraxis, with certain areas particularly involved in both. And a similar I wanted just to read you this. This was one of the commentaries to Mark Lewis, someone who is very sympathetic to the view, but I think he summarizes the point quite nicely. He's saying, apparently, psychological function and physiological function are not aligned in any simple harmony. So not emotion, the psychological function of emotion and the one of cognition don't seem to map neatly onto physiological function. So they say, at least not in the way we approach them in psychological theory. The conclusion then must be unsettling for psychologists. Whereas, maybe not to phenomenologists. I was actually quite excited to read this. It says, whereas the separation of emotion and cognition seems to be obvious to a functional analysis, the complexity of interactions among multiple systems for arousal, for specific action tendencies, or for more general attentional and memory biases leads to great difficulty in saying what is cognition and how it differs from emotion. Another voice that kind of seems to be speaking here to the same issue is Luis Pessoa, who was mentioned by Professor Azada. And I'm referring to here to a 2008 paper, but he actually has a book published in 2013, and now a paper in behavioral and brain sciences with lots of commentaries. So if I still have to read those carefully, but he's really again trying to get across the same message. So in this 2008 paper, he said, parceling the brain into cognitive and affective regions is inherently problematic and ultimately untenable. And again, the strategy is the same. He did this meta-analysis of lots of different studies where things turned out to be involved in not just emotion or not just cognition. So he said the amygdala is not just a fear module, but also critical for attention, associative learning, value representation, decision making. The prefrontal cortex is being increasingly segmented into parts that are also not just obviously cognitive or purely cognitive. So the anterior cingulate cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, ventromedial prefrontal cortex. He says even the lateral prefrontal cortex is sensitive to emotional character of stimuli in working memory tasks. And it goes on, so it's more than this. So Pessoa ultimately then, his more theoretical view is like, well, actually, the reason why also things are so messy is because the brain is best understood as a complex system that cannot be broken down into parts with dedicated functions. I mean, that's maybe too strong, but he's thinking about psychological functions that are very broadly characterized, such as cognition and emotion. So his view is rather that different functions depend on different modes of self-organization of distributed neural processes. And with this, there are other neuroscientists who take this large system or complex view on the brain. And so Pessoa in this paper that I've seen, his view is the same in the book and the BBS paper I mentioned. So what does he think then eventually about emotion and cognition? Well, he doesn't think that then we just throw away everything. His view seems to be that we still, these are still useful concepts to describe behavior. And sometimes we want to say that some behavior seems to be more emotional than others. But what we should not do is to think that these map onto dedicated brain systems, some of which clearly are responsible for the cognitive behavior and the others are responsible for the emotional one. Rather, his view is that, well, the brain is a complex system where there are self-organizing networks that include different brain areas, and this can overlap, so one area can participate in one network or in another network. And then depending on the network in which the areas are organized, they will perform or have different functions that then will influence behavior in a different way. So, as I put it here, ultimately Pessoa's proposal is to view emotion and cognition as interdependent dimensions of behavior resulting from the activity of a variety of brain areas, none of which is intrinsically either emotional or cognitive, but rather all of which contribute to behavior differently depending on the broader neural context in which they happen to participate. And so if you want to read more, that's the book.
I have a question. So in this case, which area is especially related to the which area of the brain is especially related to this neural computation?
I don't know. I don't think I don't know if he says more specifically, but I think that's just a very theoretical view of how, we should think about, I think about the brain in general and how it supports psychological functions. But then, in the case of affectivity and cognitive, I don't know actually. I don't know if he has a. I know that he has done lots about the amygdala and how the amygdala, for example, modulates visual perception, and so maybe one of these would be the amygdala. Sorry, I interrupted you.
So at least I think the amygdala is very important for the emotions. But other places, I would ask,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the claim would never be that, say, the amygdala is not important here. The claim is rather that we shouldn't try to say that the amygdala, that's what it does. Like some people, like there's a paper by Oman and Mineka, they say the amygdala is the fear module. Where module means, informational encapsulated brain system, meaning it does what it does and it's not mean. And he's saying, no, the amygdala is influenced by, does so many different things depending on task, context, how it's interconnected with other. Yeah, that's the idea.